and that 500 years from now, someone with skin my color and moccasins on his feet will climb up the ramparts and rest and look over the river and feel that he, too, has a place in the universe.
I have an ongoing series where I recommend Black and Indigenous authors and books, and I know that recommendations can often be very overwhelming because there can be so many books. My goal instead is to make a video with 5 recommendations each time, and I try to divide them into different areas. So one is a nonfiction, to give a memoir, a hard-hitting book that really tackles racism, but then I also try to do a book that allows the person to just exist. It's important to have books where Black and Indigenous people are allowed to live and to not be defined by trauma, and that is the point of the existing one. It's an point to have books in which we celebrate. And then at the end of each one, I give a TBR book or a currently reading book that I want to tackle next. Normally I do both Black and Indigenous authors, but because it's been a little while, I have a lot of books, so I decided that I was going to do 2 back-to-back recommendations, and this one is going to be completely Indigenous. My first one is a nonfiction book, and this is This Place, and this is an anthology collection by Canadian authors celebrating / reinterpreting what it means for Canada to be 150 years old. If you were in Canada about 5 years ago, you would be kind of overwhelmed with the amount of 150 things. And this was published a few years after and has a collection of Indigenous authors, artists, and colorists who come together to weave stories about the history of Canada and of Métis and Indigenous and Inuit people throughout our history. And it is really powerful and really beautiful. I was very torn between the fact that I think that being a graphic novel was really important. Nature and beauty and celebration of land and people is such an important part that I would never want to not have the pictures. But because it was a graphic novel, we really had to condense the contextualization of each story, which led to a lot of really awkward and really stilted things. So I almost would have liked it to be like March, like John Lewis or something like that, where we have a lot of block text rather than telling that through dialogue. For this reason, even though I recommend this book fully, I also think that for adults especially, it is much more of a good jumping off point than it is necessarily a resource in itself. I think that it's absolutely perfect for children because it is very informative and will let them have more questions. But I think for adults, it's very beautiful and really opened me up to a lot of history. I think I spent more time researching the stories in here than I did reading the book, but it was so well done. Especially the story about Frank Tassil and the Northern Pipeline. Through that story, we really had these beautiful illustrations of land alongside his speech about the protection of land and the protection of Indigenous personhood and people, and it was incredibly powerful. You can find this speech online for free, and I would really recommend that if you don't read this collection, but I really recommend it for that. Although be aware of the fact that it can be clunky at times, but being clunky does not necessarily mean that it is not useful and that it's not important, especially for people to learn about history. My memoir selection is also one of my favorite books of the last little bit, and this is A Brief History of My Body by Billy Ray Velco. He's a gay Indigenous author who grew up in rural Alberta, which is kind of rough, and he talks a lot about that and being a writer. It was incredibly visceral and incredibly raw when also being incredibly poetic. It is the book that has spoken most truly about writing that I have ever read. He weaves writing into everything. He reads poetry into everything, and as someone who is also a writer, it reminds me so much of what it means to live in that writing mind. But he also talks so much about being a creative, what it means to be a marginalized creative, what it means to be a gay man who's living in rural areas, what it means to be fetishized. And it's so open about so many things, and yet it is incredibly powerful, incredibly uncomfortable at times, but also there's power in that uncomfortability. My hard-hitting book is I Can Make This Promise by Christine Day. This is a middle grade novel that follows a 12-year-old girl whose mother was an Indigenous woman who was adopted into a white family. And she's really unraveling her family's history and what it meant and what parts of her family was not told to be a reality and what parts of her life were hidden. And it really dives into the systemic racism against Indigenous people and the breakup of families and how family and traditions are not carried on. And it is so incredibly well done and emotional. I loved that throughout her middle school art project that is a film is given the same amount of weight as finding her family history, which might seem kind of silly, but when you're thinking about being a 12-year-old and the things that matter to you, it shows that this book is not just a book about a theme. It's not just a book about let's explore racism. It's let's explore this person as a full person and what it means to be 12 and what it means to exist in this world and to exist in an interracial family, and an interracial family that wasn't necessarily chosen to be interracial, especially by the people that are the Indigenous people in a white family. And I thought that it is so well done and such a good book for children, but also such a good book for adults to read as well. The existing book is Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, and this was so wonderful. This is an epic in scope fantasy that takes place in this world where we have all of these different lands separated by sea, and we follow 3 primary characters. And the first one is this woman who is a common-born priestess, and we really follow her life. And then we follow this like queer, foul-mouthed sailor who probably couldn't be more different. And we also follow this boy who is blinded by his mother in a sacrifice, and he also has his own old story, and all 3 of them are very different, and we have a few other point of views as well sprinkled in, and I really enjoyed finding out how their worlds collected. I loved the fact that like all of the boats were called canoes and stuff like that, and you know, it's not made a point to be like this is indigenous, but it's like very clear through the language and history and stories that it is drawing and inspired by a world that is indigenous, and not only indigenous in one part but indigenous throughout. And I loved seeing a world in which Indigenous people were the main culture. It wasn't a culture in which Indigenous people were colonized. It was a culture in which Indigenous people are throughout the continents and throughout the seas, and that they get to live as separate people and as people that have their whole worlds and cultures and everything like that. And it was so beautiful. The writing and the world building was just also incredible. I was enthralled in every moment, and I was trying to figure it out, and I loved the characters, I loved the dynamics, I loved how unexpected it was, and how she was totally okay with it being bloody at times, but also being really compassionate at times. My TBR book is actually my currently reading book, and it is a book that is by Marilyn Dumont, and it's a poetry collection called A Really Good Brown Girl, and she's a Métis Canadian who was born in the 1960s, and this was published in 1996. I had no idea it was that old when I picked it up, and I really appreciated that element, the fact that it can be really difficult to read Indigenous books now because they're just not widely available, especially in like libraries and stuff like that. And to have this book that is, you know, 25 years old, the fact that it reads so contemporary is empowering, but it's also very disconcerting. We still have the same issues 25 years later is just as disappointing as it was then. And yet she talks so viscerally and so importantly and rawly about what it means to be Canadian, what it means to be a Métis. I have so much more of this collection to read, and I'm so excited. I know that she has a poem directly addressed to John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, who started residential schools, who started a lot of things. He was not a good man at all. She also deals a lot with the intersection of what it means to be both a woman and a marginalized identity, how she feels like she has to hide more of herself because her body is more sexualized because she is a woman and she is Indigenous. And it is incredibly powerful, and I can't wait to finish it. Let me know your thoughts on these books. Have you read any of them? Do you plan to read any of them? Which book by Indigenous authors would you recommend? Please leave them below. I will do my best to leave some Indigenous authors and reviewers and artists and all of that in the description, so please follow them and support Indigenous art. It's so important to read about it, but it's also really important to not just read about it theoretically, but also to be impactful on the society that you live in and to advocate for their rights as well.